Okay. So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the second talk in the series that Vyana Wealth has so beautifully started. And I'm very grateful to my good friend Abhenav for putting together this panel once again. We did this about a couple of weeks ago, where we got two of India's greatest minds on geostrategic affairs and national security, Maroof Raza and Iqbal Malhotra, and it gives me great pleasure and honor to kind of welcome them back and get them to speak to all of you all over again. And you must appreciate the fact that there are fast moving developments, and from what we spoke last time and what we're going to speak today, there could be a vast difference, and which is why I think it's good thought from Abhinav to put this again together. What I'm going to start with is with Iqbal and Maroof. Iqbal, from the last time that we left, you and Maroof gave us great insight into the background on what's happening between India, China, and the globe. What I wanted to start with is I was reading one of your pieces, and it was in the Open magazine, and you spoke about the existential crisis and China, the Chinese existential crisis, and what set me thinking was it seems as if that existential crisis for the Chinese could be the backdrop for a lot of the work that you're seeing both in India and abroad. You may want to, set this talk by sharing with the viewers on what you think is this existential crisis and and we'll take it from there on.
Well, I am one who goes against the prevailing orthodoxy, and you can almost call me a heretic in my views. I think that this whole talk about Cold War is, the Cold War has actually now getting to become hot because
Hmm.
the existential crisis faced by the Chinese accentuated in May this year when the US Department of Commerce they passed a legislation which prohibited the sale of microchip processes, and microchip making manufacture machinery, which is protected by US patents to a company called Huawei. Now, Huawei is a company which is one of the dominant electronic companies in the world, and it is largely owned by the PLA with a lot of frontmen. The CFO has been arrested in Canada 2 years ago, and is awaiting extradition to the United States. And the United States government has taken a bipartisan consensus into its actions, and they have decided to destroy this company completely. Now, what is this company and why is it so important for the survival of China and for the achievement of Xi Jinping's goals of world domination? Huawei is about to launch 90 5G mobile networks in different parts of the world, and the volume of this business is worth about $500 billion. So once the ban came into effect in May, and this governs 6 nanometer and 7 nanometer scale microchips, which are 50% of them are manufactured by a Taiwanese company called the Taiwanese Semiconductor Corporation. Uh, the loss of business to China is 500 billion, and then you add to this the sale of handsets to another few billion people all over the world, which would be compatible with 5G. And then to that, you add the 5G apps. So you've got $1 trillion hit that the Chinese have taken economically. And look at the loss and look at the backward linkages and look at the loss to their whole planning process and their industry and their manufacturing and their growth and their employment figures. It's a very big loss. And coupled with that, the topping on the cake is the fact that this 5G rollout would have enabled the Chinese to identify, influence, and control everybody who would be linked to any of those networks which were set up by Huawei. So this existential crisis is very, very real, and the Chinese were attempting to test the resolve of a number of countries in the South China Sea and um, uh, India as well, because there are collateral spin-offs as a result of all these moves, which we can get into later on in the discussion. But basically, to summarize now that the gauntlet has been thrown by President Trump, and Xi Jinping has to decide what to do. either he submits to the American move, and he accepts the hegemony of American technology, and he abandons his dream for world domination and climbs down, loses face, and then faces a leadership revolt within the Communist Party of China, or he goes to react to this American gauntlet, and then we will figure out what his next moves are going to be. But he can't remain stationary and unmoved, and he's got to act. And the window of opportunity is closing very rapidly.
And I think the point you made that the Huawei ban per se and the 90 contracts plus the $500 billion, the $1 trillion business opportunity, I think those are the big drivers.
That's a realistic existential issue because they since May, they are not receiving any 6 nanometer, 7 nanometer scale chips, without which they cannot roll out those networks, and work has stopped. So it's a very, very big crisis.
Right. And so just taking on the issue around the chips and the water wars, and Maroof, if you can kind of correlate the two issues between the point that Iqbal made around the non-availability of microprocessor chips and the potential water wars, and Maroof, if you can connect the dots for us, and why would we think that that's an important issue?
See, of course, if you look at it in the immediate situation, the Chinese need the waters, fresh water, as some people would know, and Iqbal and I have written about it in our book on Kashmir, that you need something like 10,000 liters of fresh water with sand and other ingredients to make silicon wafers of about 30 centimeters square, which allows you eventually to go on to microchips. But the waters are also important to China because the area adjoining Aksai Chin, where China is wanting to acquire more and more land, is based on the fact that the Tibetan plateau and much of it, the waters have been contaminated there because of earlier Chinese nuclear tests from the Lucknow tests of 64 onwards. The second thing is that the waters that Aksai Chin per se provides, they get domination over the Aksai Chin Lake, they get domination over the waters of Pongyongso, which also flows towards China. And therefore, even today's news that they are making more and more maritime efforts to try and control whatever they can of the Pongyongso Lake, which is 750 square kilometers of water, which is 3 times, by the way, of the river waters that are providing dams to China-funded effort in POK, which is got more than $20 billion worth of Chinese funding. And therefore, the 4 dams that are coming up on the Indus, which flows into POK, is not just a goodwill gesture towards Pakistan, but it is also towards China's agenda of reaping the waters from those dams, Banji Dang and 3 or 4 others, which the Chinese are very keen to squeeze out of. And that doesn't stop the waters providing electricity or waters providing for other activities, which like agriculture, etc. It's not that you just pick up all the water from the lake and take it to China, but you can use it for multiple usages. Then China's drive for the Shaksgam Valley, which lies at one edge of northern areas of POK, which is north of Kargil also, and alongside the Siachen Glacier, which is east of that. So just briefly to understand, the Shaksgam Valley, China actually had its eyes on it well before getting Pakistan to formally give it to China, what they call as a temporary arrangement, but some things are permanently temporary, if you know what I mean. So China is going to use the waters that would come out of the 242 glaciers in the Shaksgam Valley for again serving their water agenda, which goes beyond drinking and home use water. And then you have the Chinese are now trying to take control over water resources, even in the Brahmaputra, because inconsistent flow of Brahmaputra is now leading to all sorts of problems in Assam, sometimes an overflow, sometimes an underflow. And China has been very reluctant to share water data with India on Brahmaputra. Now, China has one big advantage, that it actually sits on the upper riparian status of many of the major waterways of Asia, certainly, whether it's the Indus system, which comes from Tibet, whether it is the Brahmaputra, whether it is the Mekong River. So all of them allow China to exercise leverage over the neighbors who are lower riparian. It's, as I always say, our diplomats are so arrogant that they never learn lessons from either the Chinese or the Pakistanis, who are your true adversary. And they're only looking for how to engage with the world and how to dress with the world, how Western diplomats do it. Because the reality of hard-nosed diplomacy is not wearing silk ties and knowing your wines. It is knowing how to get the maximum out of your adversary. Now, let me give you another example. We are an upper riparian state when it comes to the Indus water system. But the Indus water system, not only Nehru happily gifted 80.48% of the Indus rivers to Pakistan as per the Indus Treaty, which was negotiated with Pakistan with the World Bank. But we are sitting on 19.48% or 52% of the Indus Waters Treaty, and we are not being able to use even that. So the myth that has grown in Pakistan, that if there is a shortage of water in Punjab in Pakistan, which dominates virtually all public discourse in Pakistan, then India is stopping the waters. And India actually hasn't really got its act together. Let's forget the last 70 years. Even the last several years after the Uri attack, which led to our commando strikes, people had been engaging at the top level to find out that can you put pressure on Pakistan to stop terrorism by using water as a tool. And Pakistan happily smiled back to say you can't, because you don't have systems in place to either divert the rivers or to slow down the water or to use what is yours. We're not in using that less than 20% which belongs to us, and we're having this grand designs of how we're going to arm twist Pakistan with 5 Rafales. Okay, so that's one. And the other important aspect is there are 3 or 4 landmarks which we should not ignore. The first is that, when the Chinese made their intrusions in Aksai Chin, it was not to go an extra mile and claim our border. It was to basically take control of the catchment area of the Aksai Chin Lake, which is huge, to take control of the sources of the Indus River. And even today, they're encroaching towards the Galwan Valley, because the Galwan River again is a source of water. So that's one. The second thing is that China and Pakistan have been working for years for creating pressure on India, essentially through controlling the sources of water. Siachen Glacier, for example, has 100 million cubic cc's of water. And some say that it can provide water for Delhi's needs for 55 years. Or some say it can provide for eternity for the needs of, say, another lesser populated part of northern India. But we've done nothing except sit pretty on Siachen's outer reaches, that is the Saltoro Ridge on the west and the Karakoram on the east. And we are sitting there for 30 years and just trying to wait the Pakistanis off with no other scientific data or effort being made. We're trying to reach the bloody moon and the Mars. Why? Because they might give you a trickle of water. Or why? Because it's fashionable to stand up and say that for the less than a cost of a Hollywood film, we put a satellite in Mars. But why don't you put money where you need it? I'm giving you a last example, and we can go back to Iqbal. Nepal is a water-rich country. You have lost your neighbor in Nepal because you've put money into Afghanistan, which is a black hole as far as I'm concerned. But you didn't put money enough in helping Nepal build dams to control some of its river flow which would give Nepal revenue through selling of electricity and water to India, but also earn you goodwill despite taking money out of them, or maybe just write off that with an equivalent of $1 billion, that first $1 billion worth of expenses we write off, we give it as a gift to Nepal. And they would be singing your song. Oli would not be engaging with the Chinese. That's the Nepalese Prime Minister. The same you've done with Bangladesh. So water is the future where conflicts would be fought. I'd leave it at that. We'll come back to more later.
I think thanks, Iqbal, and for putting the context right. Like you started off with giving us the background on the existential crisis that the Chinese face, and Maroof, you given us the insight around why water is necessary. I'm now going to shift focus and kind of speak about something that is not really out in the open and not many people talk about it. In India, war, or for that matter, in the public, war means kinetic war, regular war, which is tanks, air force, armies, and navies. But I wanted the two of you all, and Iqbal, we can start with you. What are the other aspects of war which we are in the middle of? For example, cyber, electromagnetic pulse, a part of which we spoke was water wars. So if you can kind of lay the ground for us, what it means to be in a non-kinetic war, and are we in the middle of one already?
Let me just say one thing in the beginning, that for any war to happen, it has to have an outcome, an intended outcome.
Right.
And the first salvo fired by the Americans was fired because the Chinese actually initiated this whole process way back in 2016. Now, in 2016, the US Navy launched two stealth destroyers. One was called the USS Zumwalt, and the other was called the USS Michael Monsoon. And these two destroyers, cost about a few $billion, about $4 or $5 billion a piece. And on their preliminary maiden sea trials, the propulsion system of both of these destroyers collapsed. And they did a forensic examination, and they discovered that the propulsion systems collapsed because of defective chips that had a backdoor that enabled an electromagnetic pulse to be sent through that backdoor, that led to the collapse of the chips and the collapse of the propulsion system of those two vessels. Now, these chips were apparently supplied by, it has not yet been released. I think it's classified information, but if you go onto the dark web, you will find that people are saying that these chips were manufactured by a division of Huawei called High Silicon. So this actually set the ball rolling. And then in 2018, this lady was arrested, who was a CFO in Canada, and she's still facing extradition to the United States of America. Now, the Americans then realized that, look, this whole process of having an open door relationship with the Chinese, letting Chinese companies, be based in America, letting them, turning a blind eye when they steal industrial secrets, and allowing 400,000 Chinese students to study in American universities and then to get absorbed into Silicon Valley and other high-tech American companies, has resulted in the drain of information to China and technology to China. In fact, when I think it was in 2018, when Trump and Xi Jinping had a meeting, I think it was in Florida, and Xi Jinping articulated his view. He said that in the future, we are not going to buy technology from you. We are not going to buy any manufactured products from you. We are only going to buy agricultural products from you and minerals from you. So we will be making everything, and we will be selling to you. So the Americans got very worried. Now they figured out that they have to destroy Huawei if they have to stop the Xi Jinping juggernaut. And this Xi Jinping juggernaut is powered primarily by Huawei. And as I said a little while ago, $500 billion worth of 95G mobile contracts to be executed. The $1.3 trillion Xi Jinping technology initiative that is going to make China the #1 preeminent power in the world. Unfortunately for the Chinese, all of this is predicated on American technology, on American patents, on American microchips. So the US, to my mind, has decided two things. Firstly, that they want to go in for regime change, because economic decoupling from China is not possible. I mean, look at us. We have outsourced Apsara and Ajanta pencils to China. They manufacture pencils. They've been manufacturing agarbattis because the Indian businessmen found that it was much cheaper to manufacture them in China because capital costs are here very high. Prime borrower has to pay 13% to borrow money for his working capital, and in China you pay 1 or 2% or 0%. It's subsidized by the government. So economic decoupling is very difficult because if you try and decouple, then your costs are going to go up and your economies will shrink. So what do? You change regime. Why? Because there are factions within the Communist Party of China who are not that aggressive as Xi Jinping is and who are willing to work within the rules of the international framework. And also that the issue is that the terms of trade have been weighted against the rest of the world. So they need to reverse the terms of trade so that Chinese buy more, they accrue smaller surpluses, and therefore those surpluses are not going to be used to try and dominate the world and create a new tributary system of vassal states where everybody pays their obeisance to the Chinese. So this is the outcome of the war that the US has willy-nilly got into, because for them also it is an existential crisis that they cannot let the Chinese take over. They cannot let the Chinese be the new Orwellian big brother ruling the world. So now the issue is that how will this war be conducted? And will it be a kinetic war? Will it be a war where they fire electromagnetic pulses that cripple our command and control systems and the American command and control systems? Or will they attack American satellites and Indian satellites in the sky? Or will they introduce bots into our computer network, which will replicate and cripple our networks? Will they attack our entire power system in the country or our banking system? We don't know. Nobody knows this unless and until the government of India has war gamed these eventualities and these probabilities and figured out the outcomes and try to anticipate. You see, this is where I differ with Maroof, that the era for strategic autonomy or being a swing state is gone, because either you are with the Americans and get their technology, or you are with the Chinese and get their technology and be a subservient, submissive power at the same level as the Pakistanis. Because the time has come to choose a side. You have to choose a side. If you don't choose a side, you will be steamrollered by the Chinese and they will finish you off. Because they are an insidious, they have an insidious government, and they are more powerful than us if they fight a war on 6 different fronts. And we need the Israeli technology and the American technology to be able to protect ourselves and align ourselves. And after the world order has changed for the better, we can then revert back to our process of strategic autonomy. But in order to contain this Chinese threat and this threat of a militant Pakistan, and you've got now Iran, maybe it's aligning, maybe it's not aligning, we don't know. But they fired those rockets at that Al Dhafra air base in the UAE, where our famous 5 Rafales, the famous 5, had settled for the night. So, those are signals. Now, either you ignore those signals or you read those signals and say, look, these are signals and we are going to bring this into a matrix, discount them, and then figure out what the next moves are. So it's very difficult to say what the government is going to do because we don't know. They're not even preparing us. They're not even preparing the nation for the eventuality of a war with China. God forbid something were to happen, we would be caught napping if we don't know how do we react if something like that happens. It's time to actually talk about it rather than to, pretend that, you bury your head in the sand like an ostrich and say, when it happens, then we'll figure it out. Then we'll be flapping around, trying to figure out our responses. But we need some cohesion and some clarity as to what is happening internationally, and this political spin that is being fed to us, that these great 5 Rafales have come now and they are going to tilt the balance and the Chinese are cowering and the Pakistanis are cowering. That's all rubbish. That's infantile political spin, which trivializes the whole issue.
Okay. Yeah, Maroof, you wanted to say something, and then I'll have a follow-up question as well for you.
Okay. See what Iqbal said, he differs with me about the swing state argument. You see, what is a swing state? A swing state is one which becomes part of a consensus effort, but is not completely in your camp. So nobody is suggesting that we swing between America and China, that when you get more trade deals from China, then you keep quiet, and otherwise you join the American effort, say in South China Sea, which they have all come to now keep referring as the Indo-Pacific. But there are many other aspects that we have to understand. Is your rivalry with China the only defining point in your foreign policy? I don't think it is. For example, any relationship with American will come at a price. They will extract from you whole kind of territorial concessions, which I am for. For example, giving them naval base in Andamans and the Laccadives. And I have in principle, no problem with it, though a lot of, nationalists will turn around and say, Bharat ki zameen hai. और मैं उनको कहता हूं कि भाई जो आपके कब्जे में होनी चाहिए वो तो काबू नहीं आ रहा है, चाहे पीओके है, चाहे अक्साई चिन्ह है, but you're going to keep trying to chest thump for issues which most people can't even point out on the map, that where the Laccadive Islands are. Andamans have been in the news, so perhaps people will know. But let me go to other issues. The thing is that you are still getting more strategic inputs from the Russians in a number of areas, which the American defense industry would be reluctant to give you because they are so profit margin oriented. Whether it's jointly developing a fighter which has been shelved for a while, on lease nuclear submarines, which the Russians have given to you in the past and are giving you even now, or a whole string of weapon systems which you don't have to haggle with them too much, like getting them to set up a Kalashnikov factory in India for the 500,000 Kalashnikovs you need, because that's the war you are fighting on the ground, whether in the valley or in the LAC. Yeah, I mean, all these bigger weapons platforms are basically built around giving people jobs in those countries and giving them money, etc. So, I mean, there is a totally different debate that one wouldn't like to get into about to what extent you should go along with the Americans and to what extent you shouldn't. I certainly see that Manmohan Singh and Modi have both been very open to making multiple visits to the US and trying to engage with all sorts of elements there, which will, in their mind, get more investment into India, sure. But something we should not forget, that there are huge Chinese investments also in India. And China has more business engagements with Taiwan than it has with India or will ever have with India, and the sheer volume of dollars that are being exchanged in either way. But given half a chance, they'll capture everything in Taiwan if they can, including TSMC, the organization which is the largest producer of microchips other than the Americans. And so the Americans have also sort of put some restrictions on what can be sold to China by those guys in Taiwan. Taiwan Chinese, Iqbal was only explaining to me how the Chinese are willing to roll over Taiwanese territory given half a chance. But let me explain to you a deeper issue. A deeper issue is, why is all this happening? It's happening because, amongst other things, Xi Jinping in particular, the leader of China right now, and supreme leader as some people refer to him, and Mr. Mike Pompeo, the US Secretary of State, has dismissively referred to him as the General Secretary of the Communist Party. But either way, he is more powerful today than Mao Zedong was. Second thing is, he has a vision of his self-belief that he's worked out and spelt out actually in an interview in 2000 in which he talked about, the need for persistence, patience, and following your own defined goals. He even says, in some of his interviews, that opportunities will not come in peacetime. Opportunities will come during war. And so a conflict for him, or a conflict-like situation like the current one, is a sort of black swan event for him. And he and his cronies are looking at exploiting that. He has systematically, despite the poker face he presents everywhere, has eliminated all opposition to him. He has systematically put aside all kind of ideological drivers that were inherited from Mao, who was not necessarily a nice guy. If he could kill 45 million people in the Great Leap Forward, I mean, what is 45 odd soldiers dying for them on a fist battle with our soldiers at Galwan? You know, for Chinese leadership, lives don't matter. The bigger goal matters. Here is this man who promised to the Chinese people by 2020, that is this year, China would double its GDP or its per capita income of as it existed in 2010. So he's under pressure. You know, whether the virus has come through default or design, the virus situation has to be exploited. He's bounced back. His country is bounced back. And there are all sorts of arguments that how China could control it in one or two specific regions where it's spreading like wildfire even now in America. And therefore, there is a leadership vacuum in the world. And China, with its handouts, has a whole lot of countries from Africa and Asia, which in a benevolent way, they've called part of the outpost for the Belt and Road Initiative. But it's those countries that are looking for a leadership model, which China is providing to them. America isn't, because Trump doesn't know whether he's coming or going, quite literally, after November. And then you have the Western world, who's more concerned about servicing their people and their economy. You know, China can live with debts. The West can't live with debts because it's a philosophy over a period of time that's come to be in the Western world. So he's exploiting that. And in addition to that, you know, there's Xi Jinping's thoughts, which have now been embedded in Chinese constitution, which is a lot more than any of his predecessors except Mao Zedong can boast of, even if they were to meet in hell or heaven. That listen, my thoughts were embedded in the constitution. And this is now a driver for him that he has to make the Chinese people enjoy the benefits of global preeminence. He's promised them that. And the most important thing is that the Chinese are now openly talking about a new Cold War. Whether it's going to be a Cold War or, as Bruce Riedel has suggested in his latest book, that the LAC could be the start of the next World War. Only time will tell. But measured steps by India are also being initiated because friends in Washington are telling it, based on research done there, that really don't go over the top despite public push to the Modi government ki kuch karke dikhao. So all sorts of spins are being added. I'm a big critic of how it's been dealt with. I just wrote a piece last week to say it, you know, has a reminder of how things evolved in Kargil. The only difference was that you fought a beatable enemy in Kargil, and you're now facing an enemy, Rafale or no Rafale, is not beatable. So at best, you can hold your ground, your territories, which they've anyway encroached a bit on. And as I've been saying from the very beginning, and Iqbal agrees with that they are there to stay. Not just the winter, just like they came in the 50s and 60s in Aksai Chin, and we kept trying to hide it under a lid. And Nehru gave it another spin then. The current leadership is giving it another spin now. But the reality is, as the map you will show eventually, that they have absorbed a chunk. Now, whether that chunk of land they've absorbed is actually yours or not is contestable. Even I would contest it because A, it was an area where there was no territorial definition actually agreed by both sides. Two, it is an area where China has laid claim to again and again, and you have only recently initiated new maps in which you go and support the Johnson Line, which had initially come to be to define the outreaches of the Kingdom of Jammu and Kashmir, or eventually the province of Ladakh, as now it's been said, the Union Territory of Ladakh and the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir. So if you look at the new maps, you'll see that we are again extending it there. But like Nepal, you can keep making maps, but the truth is what you hold on ground. And you are just about holding on to the LAC, you know, and any of this bombast that comes to us that we'll go back and claim our territory if push comes to shove, I don't think so, is militarily possible. whether in POK or whether in this, you have the resources, you consolidate here. And, for the life of me, I keep bringing up this Afghanistan point. You're wanting to play a role there. You go and put $2 billion. People turn around and say, oh, that's not much money. It's a lot of money in our neighborhood. It may not be much considered the foolish trillion that the Americans have spent, but you are looking for high table rights, which you're again denying. As anybody would tell you, what are you paying for? You'll go and put money into a new development of a property complex to say, you just, remember in your prayers that I also put money. The least you'll want is a bloody car park, if not at least a room in that complex. So I'm just of the view that your whole China policy needs a rethink. And it does not necessarily have to come sitting with your thumb in your mouth on a maker's lap. You have to put your bloody thumb on your head and push it hard to think an out of the box approach, which doesn't let the world to assume that it's Indians, so you can, project their behavior. You have to, as Sun Tzu said, and this is the great Chinese philosopher, that the enemy expects you to do three things. Do the fourth.
Got it. Thanks, Maroof. And actually, both you and Iqbal may differ on the swing state issue, but the commonality on both of them is that the time for non-alignment is gone. And for truth, that time is, at least that's where you all see eye to eye on this issue. And from there, Iqbal, if I was to take on from what Maroof is saying, what if we were to then prepare ourselves militarily, or for that matter, in a non-kinetic way? What's your opinion on this entire effort around the Quad? And what does that mean? I mean, I think Maroof made the point that it's going to be tough for us to, at best, we can stand our ground. But as we read more about the Quad and what it brings to the table, any views on how does that change the game?
Yeah, actually, you see, the Quad is a grouping of 4 countries: Australia, Japan, India, and the United States, to basically try and contain China through its maritime weaknesses. Now, 90% of China's oil flows from the Middle East through the Strait of Malacca into China. Recognizing their vulnerability, they started this Belt and Road Initiative with the Pakistan government, which is the CPEC, so that they have taken control of the Gwadar port, and they are also at the with the Iranians at the Strait of Hormuz. Now we expect Chinese to move into Iran and to start getting active around the Chabahar port, around that area. So they have tried to build an alternative route to supply oil to Western China through land-based pipelines, oil and gas through Pakistan. Now, the third thing is that the Chinese are also using the opportunity of global warming and the melting of the polar ice cap in the Arctic to set up an alternative Arctic route, because a lot of their oil comes from Venezuela. So instead of coming through down the Cape of Good Hope or through the Suez Canal and then into the Strait of Malacca and into China, they will go northwards through the Arctic into China. So they're already diversifying and they're taking active steps to do that. Now, the Chinese are most vulnerable in the Strait of Malacca and in the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, which is where the Saudi oil comes from. And that's why they have got this base in Djibouti, which is at the Horn of Africa, from where the strait opens up into the Indian Ocean, the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb. So the issue is that it's going to take us time to build up our military strength. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's going to take a few years. We've neglected that. In fact, under this current government of Mr. Modi's, the military spend as a percentage of our GDP has gone down from 2% during Manmohan Singh's time to now 1.5% under the Modi government. And earlier on, it used to be about 2.5% around Mr. Vajpayee's time, and it steadily came down. So if there is a conflict tomorrow, what is likely to happen? I mean, the point is this, that neither am I an admiral or a general or the defense minister or anyone else, but I'm just an ordinary analyst and looking at the situation. I mean, I would say the Quad would try and block, and they can successfully do so, Chinese shipping at the Strait of Malacca.
Mhm.
So, in order to be able to do that, you need to have a close synergy with the Japanese, the Australians, and the Americans, and the other littoral states around there: Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam. And therefore, once you have a concerted block and you're actually blocking the flow of oil, you're actually taking an action against the Chinese, they'd start thinking twice about, doing other things, because it's a question of what your responses are. If you have a robust response without firing a shot, the other guy knows that, look, I'm going to get a beating. Now, willy-nilly, the 16 Bihar Ghatak commandos, they attacked, counter-attacked after their commanding officer was killed. So the Chinese know that the will to fight in the Indian soldier is there. And given a free hand, the Indian soldier will unleash terror upon the Chinese. So it boils down to the political resolve. Now, politically, if you take a step and say, yes, I am going to resist Chinese pressure, I don't want to be a vassal state to China and enjoy great trade and a great trade in the continuing trade imbalance. It's not like that there's a mutually balanced trade, and I am going to accept Chinese hegemony. That's a different matter. But if you say that you want to be a swing state or you want to be strategically autonomous, then keep your self-respect. And if you want to keep your self-respect and your dignity, then you have to show the other guy that I'm not a pushover. And I am going to resist. And I have got friends in the region to resist. I mean, if there's a big bully and there's a giant and I'm a small person, then I'll align with other people to be able to face up to that bully. So China is the bully, it's the hegemon. It is taking steps. So we need to face up to that reality and align with our neighbors to block them. Now, what strategy they adopt in blocking, I don't know. But my feeling is that the Quad is a very important political grouping, and I am not saying that we should become a vassal state of the Americans. We already have signed deals with them. We've already got military agreements with them. We are buying weapons for them. And as to this point of these Russian weapons, let me tell you that the Russian weapons today have a lot of maintenance issues. They have a lot of pricing issues, and they don't come under that very favorable condition that existed in the past. So I mean, we can get into that debate about American weaponry and French weaponry and Russian weaponry, but I do feel that the Indian armed forces are obsessed with buying new and new weapons. You can buy retired American transport aircraft. You don't need the latest state-of-the-art transport aircraft. You can buy retired American transport aircraft. You can buy these aerial refueling tankers. You don't have to go for the latest stuff. And you can get them under preferential terms. So you can't do the same with the Russians because their equipment doesn't have that longevity and it doesn't have that sophistication. It's very useful, it's very hardy, it's very rugged. And about that point about the AK-47 rifles, which are now called the AK-203, that factory is still not being set up because there's a pricing dispute. And so until that pricing dispute is resolved, you've gone and bought from the Americans. But you've already ignored the Indian companies that have the indigenous technology to manufacture rifles. Rifles is not a rocket science. If we can build an intercontinental ballistic missile, we can build an automatic rifle. So why not give the Indians a chance and let them also do what they show their capabilities? I mean, we have the capability, but we're always discounted because all the top brass in all the services want these fancy toys which are manufactured in the West, and they want to be on par with them. Yes, we are also flying this, we are also sailing this, we are also driving this. But cut your cloth as to the kind of cloth you have. So I feel that the Quad needs to be formed into a secretariat. It must be like a grouping, a proper formalized structure, and it must have a military perspective, and it's an alliance, and it must have a civilian perspective and an economic perspective. Like the old treaties used to be the Warsaw Pact or NATO. NATO is still there, but we need this because we face a common threat.
Got it. We're kind of 45 minutes, 50 minutes into the conversation. What I want to do over the next 2-3 minutes between the two of you is, what about chinks in the Chinese armor? If you can share with the audience your own perspectives respectively on what are those chinks while you all have researched and spoken so much about China, your own views, and may not necessarily be the views of the present disposition, but I'd be very curious to hear from your individual
I'll very quickly say that the first chink in the Chinese armor is the fact that their economy is decelerating.
Mhm.
The second chink in the Chinese armor is that they have an aging population and it's rapidly aging. And the third chink in the Chinese armor is that they have diverse nationalities, which they have, and they've tried to trample the indigenous element of those nationalities. You've got Manchurians, you've got Mongolians, you've got Xinjiangese, and you've got Tibetans. I feel that we have two cards that we have not played so far, which are not military cards, which are non-military cards and which need to be played. The first card is the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama is a venerated elder statesman. I think the government should consider giving him a Bharat Ratna and also recognizing the government of Tibet and recognizing the Dalai Lama and giving him a pulpit. Let him travel to Tawang, let him travel to Ladakh, let him give speeches, let him rally around the Buddhists, and let him become a political force. And the second card is the card of Taiwan. We should recognize Taiwan. We should have better relationship with Taiwan. We should have a military relationship with Taiwan. Why not? I mean, Pakistan can court our enemy. China can court our enemy, Pakistan. They can pour billions and billions of dollars into Pakistan, and they are unwilling, and they're not even willing to recognize our right over Kashmir or over Arunachal Pradesh. But we are so scared of propping up the Dalai Lama, and we are so scared of shaking the hand of the Taiwanese. What for? We can do these things very easily. There's no military response needed, and tell the Chinese that, look, send a signal that, hey, listen, we are not sitting here under, in a coffin that we were put into by Mr. Nehru in 1950 because of the virtues of non-alignment that China has to be appeased at any cost. The lid of the coffin is open. It's the day of judgment. The skeletons have risen, and now we're going to put flesh to them, and we are going to use Tibet and Taiwan as our two political cards in this fight against the Chinese.
Correct. Maroof?
Well, I want to basically talk on two things. One is a bit on the Quad and a bit on China's own restrictions and one or two other points that Iqbal made. See, firstly, just let me briefly touch on the Russian equipment part. We believe, if there are strategic restrictions put on our scientists, they can even send rockets up into the sky. But, arms purchase has always been an area which has suited a lot of people. Let's not just blame politicians. From bureaucracy to the military establishment, they all have some benefits worked out in their mind for new boys for toys, new toys for the boys. The second thing is that AK rifle that is going to be manufactured compared to what our people had manufactured, the DPSUs, many of them were breaking in the hands of our soldiers when they were firing. And your battles are not going to be fought by submarines. It's going to be fought on the ground, the brutal battlefields on the LAC, LOC, or Kashmir. So you need good, handy weapon systems. It's not for nothing that the AK rifle is still very much in the emblem of ISIS and a whole lot of other jihadi groups and the flags they fly, because it is the most robust, reliable, tough weapon systems that the infantryman needs in crossing nalas, fighting in dirt, dust. Everything needs minimum maintenance. So that is why the Indian military establishment has this soft spot for a lot of Russian stuff, which technologically is not state of the art always, although the S-400 missile system is. But there's a lot of stuff that our people are used to, and they want to continue to do with that, then run into, because Western equipment, also let me tell you, has its very long list of maintenance costs, which don't come up in the initial pricing that you see on newspapers and others. But anyway, to go into Quad, now you see the Quad has 2-3 limitations. Though I think in principle it's a good idea, but it's just taken off in the last 6 months that the foreign ministers have engaged with each other. It's not even at the head of government, the prime minister level. And second thing about Quad is that the Americans are dicey partners to have even in the Quad. They're right now in the high seas, stretched on 3 operational fronts: in Taiwan, in South China Sea, and maybe showing a little teeth to the Chinese in the Indian Ocean or Arabian Sea area. And they want to also do something in terms of browbeating the Iranians, but they're not successful there either. So, I think it's suddenly come into reckoning because everyone, and I've been one who's been saying, you want to remove pressure from the mountains, you put pressure in the high seas, and their pressure will ease off. So the Quad can be used, but I wouldn't rely on any Quad partner to help India take on the Chinese Navy, which we currently have an edge over in the waters around the Straits of Malacca. I mean, if politically we have the will to go into losing a few ships in battle, but making China feel the pain. The military has the will, but is the political will there or not? That's a big question mark. Now, let me tell you what's wrong with the Chinese military. A, they have a long history of corruption. So, we might have had the old Tehelka case, but in the Tehelka case, there was an odd retired general who was working for an arms company and trying to get a deal. Here in the case of China, I mean, hell of a lot of generals, including Xi Jinping, has set aside because they have very dubious track records of arms deals and money that they make. And the grand life in the George Orwell term of some being more, all are equal, but some are more equal than others. You don't see much of that happening anywhere else but in China. And the generals are certainly more equal than others. The third weakness of the Chinese military is most of the people who are there, they're conscripted, they're not volunteers, they're not inspired, and they don't want to die because they are one-child family products. So if they die, a whole lot of problems will come into the family. And most importantly, they haven't fought a conflict since 1979 when they ventured towards Vietnam to teach them a lesson, but they ended up learning a few lessons themselves. The Indian armed forces, especially a simple salt of the earth infantryman that fought in Galwan, they are tough as nails. I've had the privilege of serving with them. I know them. I was in the infantry too. And believe me, they get you to push the limits. And they will bloody well give China more than a bloody nose given half a chance. There are examples of when generals refuse to take Delhi's consent and let fly at Nathula. And the Chinese were spending days pulling their dead back across the McMahon line. They never come up with figures. They never admit figures. But in today's transparent world, the figures come out, whether from Galwan or the past. So I think we have our advantages. We now have a psychological advantages that despite being ambushed, we killed at least twice, if not 3 times the number. So the Chinese army is going to come in with a bit of hesitation, though pushed from behind by their generals by saying, if you don't take their bullet in your front, we'll have bullets in your rear. But in the Indian army, they're like dogs on a leash. You just got to tell them, go. And believe me, they'll go and lynch the buggers next time if this happens. So I think we have our advantages. And I think the tragedy of this country is that our political leadership in a Nehruvian legacy has not understood what it means to use power that comes from a barrel of the gun. We think, and that's a Maoist quote, by the way, and we think we can out-talk them through diplomacy, but quite clearly the limits of diplomacy has been shown at Galwan. You have to now get on to using other forces of comprehensive national power, which the Chinese use from day one, but you have to unfurl them, and believe me, you will see results. I know economically we are doing a few things like closing TikTok and all that, but the economic dependence on China is very high. But territorially, if you say, this is my territory, then either you go out and claim it or settle what your territory is. You can't have trips to China for bilateral talks. 22 has happened, and I would say more than half of them have gone on sightseeing.
Okay, Iqbal, just on one added point, some good points that Maroof and you made, but I just wanted to pick yours and Maroof's brains on an aspect which you all are remarkably great at, which is research. A lot of what we've spoken is also about what's going to happen in the future and the current state of affairs. But I'd really like the viewers to listen to what your research has thrown up. What did 62 lessons throw up? Or what did 67 throw up? Because very little is known about 67. And between you and Maroof, if we can get the viewers to hear about your individual research and learnings, um, that would be wonderful.
I'll start with this fact that my research threw up that the British were excluded from the nuclear race by the Americans after the death of President Roosevelt. And the British then figured that they had no choice but to, if they wanted to become a nuclear power in the post war world, they had to go and build the bomb themselves. And the best thing that they could do was to spy on the Russians and get driblets of information about how to build the bomb from the Americans. So what they did was that in Gilgit, which was under their control in 1945, they set up one acoustic monitoring station and two seismic monitoring stations to actually track the attempts of the Soviet Union to build the nuclear bomb in Semipalatinsk, which was just across the border from Xinjiang in Soviet, then in Soviet Kazakhstan. So these three seismic and nuclear monitoring stations actually defined the history of Kashmir and the Pakistani invasion and the Chinese invasion into Kashmir. Now, this fact, obviously, scholars never came across it because it was probably only declassified recently. But I discovered in the course of my research that these three nuclear stations, and I'll just get their name right. One was called, the seismic monitoring station was called Stowage, which was which was set up near the Indus River. And the two acoustic monitoring stations were called Tag Day and Beaver. Now, the British wanted, in post-independence India, to retain control of these three nuclear monitoring stations till they had detonated their own nuclear device. That actually happened in 1952. Now, my understanding is that this question was posed to Mr. Nehru, that will you permit British nuclear monitoring stations on your soil in an independent India? Now, because Mr. Nehru was pursuing the course of non-alignment, he wanted to appease the Chinese and he wanted to appease the Soviet Union. He never knew that the Soviet Union and the Chinese had got together to stab him in the back. So very naively, he said, no, I do not want any British nuclear monitoring stations to remain in independent India, no British bases, because we're going to be non-aligned and you guys have to go out. Now, it's very famously known that the Indian army never recovered the entire territory of the state of Jammu and Kashmir when they were repulsing the invasion in 1947. Why didn't they do that? Mr. Kuldeep Nair has written in his book that he spoke to Major General Kulwant Singh, and General Kulwant Singh said that he got an order from Delhi that you halt the Indian army and effect a ceasefire once you've recovered the Kashmiri-speaking areas, because the state of Jammu and Kashmir is a composite state. It had people speaking the language Shina and Barhasti in the Gilgit area. It had people speaking Punjabi in that area, which is famously called Azad Kashmir in the Uri Poonch belt. It had people speaking Kashmiri in the valley. There were people speaking Ladakhi in Ladakh. And there were Buddhists in the state as well. So what Mr. Nehru said was probably made sense at that time and was a political spin that halt the Indian army and prevent it from getting Gilgit and Baltistan back, because we are only interested in recovering the valley and nothing else. Now, that effectively enabled Nehru to politically halt the Indian army and protect the British nuclear monitoring stations, because they were in Pakistani control. And we know that there were two operations, Operation Datta Khel and Operation Gulmarg, by virtue of which the British got Gilgit and they got the parts of the Uri Poonch belt and some parts of the state of the valley of Kashmir. Now, interestingly, nobody has looked at this aspect. Secondly, in 1949, when Mao visited Stalin in Moscow, and it was just 1 month after Nehru had visited Truman in Washington, and he turned down Truman's offers of aid and for India to join the alliance to be able to prevent the spread of communism, I mean the Western alliance. And he said, no, I'm going to pursue non-alignment. But Stalin was very apprehensive about the Indian army's presence in Tibet, which was a historical presence. And he had discovered that the Tarim Basin in Xinjiang was the source of a lot of minerals, like atomic nuclear minerals for the nuclear effort, like thorium, beryllium, uranium, molybdenum, and petroleum and gold. So he did not want to disclose this to Mao, but he knew that Mao had territorial ambitions. So he offered to fly PLA troops into Xinjiang. And then he told Mao that, look, you establish your presence in Tibet. Now, anybody who's traveled in Tibet, and I have driven 1,500 kilometers in Tibet from Lhasa to Mount Kailash. Anybody who's traveled in Tibet knows that, look, Western Tibet is so far away, and in 1950, it was so far away from Lhasa that it would have taken several months in the form of caravans to actually get to Lhasa. So if the Chinese were to build a road and come into Rutok, which is where the Indian army was positioned, it would have no strategic or territorial effect at all, and nor would they be able to control the Dalai Lama and his cohorts in Lhasa. So this was a ruse to actually force the Indian army out of northwestern Tibet, to close down the Indian consulate in Kashgar, to insulate the the Russian nuclear program from prying outside eyes. So this invasion took place, and the invasion happened in March 1950, and there are accounts in a couple of books which talk about the fact that which unit of the PLA moved in where, what happened, and everything else. So this is another aspect of research which was very interesting to assess. So here you see that Mr. Nehru, who was in a very naive manner, who believed in non-alignment and who believed in the honesty and integrity of Mao Zedong and Joseph Stalin, both of them actually had stabbed him in the back. And even when he discovered that he'd been stabbed in the back, in order to justify the concept of non-alignment and to ensure its success, he turned a blind eye to all of that and proceeded to go along the path of non-alignment till it became untenable for him to do so. Then he went crying to the Americans and said, hey, give me US aircraft support, give me arms aid, give me everything. After suffering the humiliation and that shibboleth of non-alignment and the shibboleth of fear, the fear of the Chinese. There is no fear of the Chinese. The Chinese are nothing. As Maroof said, our army can thrash them. Man to man, hand to hand, they can thrash them. But you need the political will to do so. This political will has been bottled and pickled and put in a achar jar on your dining room shelf, not to be eaten because it's a very expensive or very exotic achar. So, I mean, if you join the dots and you see the progression of this whole thing, and you go back historically, I mean, after all, the Indian army was in China physically under British officers from 1839 to 1939. 7 Chinese cities were run by Sikh policemen. The entire Shanghai police constabulary was run by Sardarjis. And the Chinese were absolutely terrorized into submission. So when this entire history existed up to 1939, how come in 1962, we suffered this major defeat after the Indian army defeated Hitler's Germany and it defeated Tojo's Japan? So the Indian army was not some kind of, a ragtag bobtail outfit. It was a very professional, cohesive, potent, strategic military force that kept the British Empire in its place all over the world. So, I mean, these are aspects of the research that need to be brought out into the public discourse and people to debate this fact, to learn from the mistakes of the past and the mistakes of this pernicious policy of non-alignment that caused us to come to this sorry pass that we are today, where we still fear that paper tiger called China and that paper warrior called Xi Jinping.
Okay, and I'm looking forward to the book as and when it comes out in September. It's going to be titled Red Fear, and so much of what you've spoken about will obviously be in that.
Oh yes,
book.
absolutely.
And Maroof, I'll quickly come on to to a question that I have, and Iqbal spoke about it, and obviously you also have served in the Indian Army, and you also alluded to it. World War One, World War Two, 47, 67, 71, Kargil, and now in 2020, Galwan. The Indian armed forces have obviously served remarkably well in any theater. What happened in 62? And I think it's very important that you share with us because 62 is the only thing that is reminded to us day in and day out, whereas all the other victories, and the Indian Army has been involved in so many victories, they tend to get kind of missed out. Are there any lessons from, and I don't, it's not as if I want you to speak about 62, I'm just saying there are so many theaters where we've done so well. Why is it that 62 stands out? And we're always reminded about a defeat in 62 and not about our victories everywhere else.
It's a very important question, especially to somebody like me who's passionate on matters military. There's a recent issue of the Week magazine, the cover of which says how India stopped the world being taken over by Hitler, or words to that effect. Because it was the Indian Army actually, which was the most feared set of soldiers or revered. You know, there was a division of the Indian Army, 8 Mountain Div, for example, which has been in Nagaland for years, facing the first set of insurgencies. Now it looks after the Kargil sector. It was moved there during the Kargil conflict. You know what their very sort of self-sarcastic motto was during World War II? One river more, which means that we've crossed that river. Give us one more river. We'll cross that also. And you know, in World War II, both Field Marshal Claude Auchinleck, who later came to be known as Jangi Lat Saab and was CNC India at the time of partition, of course, he played another role with the British deep state then, which Iqbal and I have brought out in a book on Kashmir. But in World War II, his most go-to formation, and the one even Rommel dreaded, was 4 Mountain Div. I mean, later became 4 Div, which operates out of Allahabad. And it got a drubbing in 62 of the sort they don't want to talk about. I mean, you go to West Point Museum in America, they have a whole lot of pictures and historical data from all of America's military campaigns, and they've been all over the bloody place. But there's nothing on Vietnam because they don't want to talk about it. And you know, the Indian Army, let me tell you, was more than happy to talk about it. It was Nehru and his gang who even went and classified the Henderson Brooks report, which basically, anyway, the terms of reference of the HB report, I've read it, that it's basically about the shortcomings of military leadership. There's nothing about political issues there really, at the NIFA front. Let me tell you in 62, some interesting information that I've come across, and it's going to be in my book, of which I'm writing on the boundary dispute, that there were half the number of troops that fought the entire 62 campaign for India than we even used in Kargil. And in Kargil, 1/20th of the Indian Army was used. 19 other equivalent outfits were not used in the Kargil conflict. But for many in our generation and younger generation, Kargil is the go-to conflict for military history because television brought it onto your screens and your laptop. But the Indian Army was not allowed to fight in 62 because I mean, you go into the whole sequence of events once, of course, you know, to start with, Nehru and Krishna Menon actually were led by even their IB chief, Bholanand Palik, who some say was living off American handouts. There are books alluding to that. But basically, he gave them to believe the Chinese will never attack us. So the whole narrative in Delhi was, there will be no Chinese attack, so why are we getting so upset about them? Notwithstanding the fact that they came into Aksai Chin in 1950, at least 10 years, if not 12 years before we went into a conflict with them. And they're sitting on your bloody territory, which even you call it today as Indian territory, as the Prime Minister asserted. But in reality, Chinese are sitting on it. So is this your territory or not? That's the first question successive leaders have never answered. The second thing is that aerial reconnaissance, a whole lot of other information by even patrols led by Captain Rajendranath, who was later my commandant at IME, were classified patrol reports when they ran into all sorts of information on the ground about Chinese build-up in Aksai Chain. 3, they put a non-combat officer in charge of the combat forces in Nifa front, a chap called Lieutenant General B.G. Kaul. He was a Nehru protege who had been built up, very smart with presentations, very slick with the word, but he was Nehru's negotiator over Kashmir. He was Nehru's negotiator at the UN missions where various dialogues were taking place over Kashmir, and then put in charge here, where he did stupid things, like even citing troops and putting them in their morchas in a river or in a nala. You never sit on a lower ground in the mountains because the other guy doesn't even have to come and engage you. He just fires at you from the top. Third, when they did come and when he was interfering with deployments of troops and morchas and everything else, troops were being given contradictory orders. So eventually the whole defense edifice collapsed. And when it collapsed, whereas in the Chinese front on Ladakh, there was a gentleman called General Daulat Singh, and General Daulat Singh was not taking much nonsense from Delhi. He had a very clear mind. But here, Karan Thapar's father, General Thapar, General Bogi Sen, Eastern Army commander, the division commander in Ladakh, in Nifa, General Pathania, his son also rose to be a general. They all were looking to Delhi to call the shots because Delhi had just told them that you guys just go on silent mode. We don't need your opinion. Krishna Menon and B.G. Kaul decided that how they would tackle the Chinese threat between debates, etc. So that's why, I went out to study it. Why did this army, which was a huge force multiplier in World War I, in World War II, Srinath Raghavan's written a volume of a book called India's War, how we actually won that war for the Allies because of the sheer tough, rugged resistance that our troops put up. And then in 47, when our government was taken by surprise once again, when the Pakistanis came and intruded into what became POK. Now, Pakistanis are very good at turning any narrative on its head. So now they turn around and say that India had taken over Kashmir, but we went and still captured this much of Kashmir, which we are holding on to as a backup force for the rest of Kashmir when it happens. But let me also sort of bring out to you, historical opportunities that we've lost as a nation. In 47, Iqbal's just mentioned to you, 47, 48, our troops didn't go beyond what came to be known as the ceasefire line, is now called the line of control with some modifications. But we didn't go beyond, not because M.J. Akbar has written in his book to say that our troops ran out of fuel, but because Delhi told the commanders, that is it, don't go beyond this line. Why? Because Sheikh Abdullah told Pandit Nehru that my writ doesn't run outside the valley. The valley is what you want, you've got it. Your troops have taken control of it. And that's all we need. Let Pakistan go to hell. But that became the launch pad for Pakistan from diplomatic initiatives to terror initiatives. The second interesting thing, which often people miss out on, it is India. When China was moving into Tibet, instead of recognizing Tibet and giving it a legal status, which then Tibet itself, Tibet needed to be recognized. You can turn around and use Angrezi and say there was no sovereign control, but there was suzerainty. But those are words you can play with. But the reality is, when the Chinese moved into Tibet between 51, 53, we failed to recognize Tibet. It took nothing then to get to All India Radio and make an announcement that we recognize it. We didn't do that. Fortunately, we did that with Bangladesh and got others to be recognizing Bangladesh after 71, because the military made sure that these stupid lessons of history are learned and not repeated. Because we didn't recognize Tibet, the Chinese legal claim over it is still over territory that was lying unrecognized, and they grabbed it. And then they give all sort of historical spin to it. We, at that point, pushed China's candidature at the UN. And then when the Americans wanted us to take a seat at the UN high table, that is Security Council, Nehru turned around and said, and his lackeys, including Shiv Shankar Menon, who later became National Security Advisor. I mean, his uncle was the guy who received Dalai Lama when he arrived after crossing the Indian boundary with China in 1959 March, MP Menon. Now, the fact is, he's also argued that we don't need a seat in the Security Council. You know, our time will come when it comes. And I add the other second sentence, till then we are happy to be equivalent to Seychelles, Fiji Islands, and places like Comoros, right? Now, the fact of the matter is that do you want to be in that gang of inconsequential 194, or do you want to be in that gang in the consequential 5 that make up the total 199 recognized states of the UN? Now, let me ask you another thing, that we gave China the seat. There are a lot of Nehru apologists who turn around and say there's no evidence, but Shashi Tharoor has done a lot of research on it. And he says, you know, everything leads, and he's a Congress wala, and everything leads to Nehru actually giving this Security Council seat to the Chinese. More importantly, between the period there's been a standoff with China and India in 1960, 1980, then even as late as 2003, 2005, the Chinese have offered us a kind of solution with maps, etc., for settling the LAC dispute, which is now in the news. We dismissed it in 1960 because by then Nehru had become victim of his own aggressive counter-China narrative. So he couldn't buckle back. In 1980, Deng Xiaoping offered it. Again, when General Sagat Singh's initiative that gave China a bloody nose in 1967, and he didn't bother to look back to Delhi and check. It's another matter, they posted him out after some time, and he was lying in quiet wait till the Bangladesh operations happened, and he was again in charge of 4 Corps that led the blitzkrieg into Dhaka and took over Dhaka before Mrs. Gandhi realized suddenly Dhaka had fallen. And when Manekshaw told her that, she ran up the steps of Parliament and stopped the Parliament proceedings. It says, ladies and gentlemen, I have good news from you. Dhaka has fallen a lot before than I thought it would. And the Indian Army gave it to you on your plate. What did you do? You squandered 94,000 prisoners of war on a promise made by the perpetual liar Bhutto, whose entire career was built on anti-Indianism. And he says, Bharosa kijiye, mujhe Pakistan jaane dijiye, and I will then give you a permanent boundary over Kashmir. That is why the damn CFL was made into the LOC, because a military line was made into a political military line. And after that, Pakistan, as usual, resigned. It refused to accept what Bhutto had said because our Maharathis did not keep any record of that, you know. And then we keep trying to give a spin, and the Congresswalas argue that we have reduced Pakistan relations to a bilateral issue. That's the only bloody fig leaf that you had left after the Shimla Agreement. And what bilateralism? It is now very clearly trilateral. There are 3 claimants to the territory of Jammu and Kashmir: Pakistan, India, and China. And you have been allowing them to be there, and only one of the 3 claimants is sitting in the UN Security Council, so it can veto any effort that you have to nail Pakistan and their terror agenda, and you put them in the Security Council. So, you know, it ashames me to think that we call ourselves a country of pundits, of wisdom. As somebody once told me, आपके सारे पंडित दिल्ली में बैठे हैं, लेकिन एक सलूशन नहीं निकाल पाए पाकिस्तान के साथ डील करने के, और मोटी दिमाग वाले पठान ने आपका चक्कर बांध दिया.
I think so much for me to absorb, so much for the audience to absorb, and I didn't realize it's almost 1.5 hours into the conversation, and just at the end of it, I'm just going to pick up the books and read Kashmir Declassified, Untold Story, and then Red Fear when it comes out.
By the way, we are coming out with a revised edition of the Kashmir's Untold Story, which is going to add all these elements into it, and this should be out by the end of November.
I'm going to be picking up my first copy, even if it is going to Khan Market and Bahari San, just going and picking up my copy. So much, like I said, for me to absorb and for the audience to gather. And there are, I can see questions that have come up on the question and answer section. So what we'll do is, I'll stop for a minute and read out some of the questions. And then over the next 10-15 minutes, we'll round this up with final comments. So young Sparsh Kelly has this question, and I think it's a very interesting question. His question is, any one of you can answer that. What is the relationship between the EU and China? And I'd probably just add a twist to it. I was listening to this news the other day between Of course, there is the EU angle in China, but there's also the German angle and the Chinese. It seems as if the Germans are not necessarily, Iqbal, you spoke about it, are not necessarily listening to what the Americans are saying when it comes to UI and banning of UI. So, any one of you can kind of lay the ground on EU and China, and specifically on how the Germans are reacting.
Well, the biggest problem EU has until now is with America, not with China. And I'll tell you why. Because Trump has upset the international order, which had made everyone very cozy and comfortable. An American sort of benevolent presence in NATO, which is very much a sort of an EU protection force, not so much as North Atlantic protection force. The second thing is that Germany in particular has business links with China, but Germany also, China has actually got business links with a lot of countries in Europe. Please understand the $1.1 trillion Belt and Road Initiative has roads from China leading right up to the gates of Europe. I was told that the Germans had kind of contested Chinese entry into their market because the Belt and Road Initiative is essentially a trade initiative. So therefore it gives Chinese products markets which they can set sail on through the sea or roll down the highways that China has made right through Central Asia into the gates of Europe. But there is the desire, and all countries in the world, by and large, their economies are linked to the low end and efficient supply chains that China has provided. And at this point of time, there is a certain view that we need to find alternate production hubs before we completely abandon the link with China, particularly at a time. And I've argued that in one of my articles in Open Magazine that, the virus that came from the lab, which I believe is the highest lab 4 category, just 300 meters from the Wuhan wet markets. So is a virus that was sent in to cripple global economies when the dependence would be more and more on China as a supply route, as well as to put in money from Chinese deep pockets, whether in the American markets or the European markets, to revive and kickstart many of the economies from cottage industries to full-scale industries. So, the funding that China still brings on the table and is basically a route where, there are daily, at least before the virus came into being, there were daily 3 flights from Italian cities into Wuhan, because many of the Europeans would fly in and fly out and do all their business directly. Now it's like 3 flights from London into Chittagong, into Sylhet near Chittagong in Bangladesh, because most of the so-called Indian restaurants actually have Bangladeshi cooks in London. So therefore, the linkage with China is very deep, and it's not, they are going to be easy to avoid, in as much as also is the European dependence on Pakistani cotton, which comes as a requirement for the garment industry in Europe, which is something that the Chinese are now helping Pakistan to scale up with the kind of technology the Chinese bring to bear. So, it's not going to be easy for anybody to untangle themselves, including India, from, as Iqbal brought out, from the presence of Chinese, including a lot of your gods and goddesses, they are made in China.
Can I just add 2-3 points here? The first point I want to make is that apart from roads, the Chinese have laid railway tracks, and the railway tracks go from China all the way to Italy and to Spain and to Germany.
Yeah.
Secondly, there are 3 flights from Wuhan into Italy every day, because there are 100,000 Chinese settled around Lake Como region of Italy, because the Italians have found that they cannot manufacture their leather products and their garments as cheaply as the Chinese can, but they cannot get the garments manufactured in China and put the label made in Italy. So they brought the Chinese into Italy so that they can take advantage of the low labor cost and they can still say that this is made in Italy. And the fact of the matter is that the Chinese have laid these railway tracks, they've made these roads because they wanted to penetrate into the heartland of Europe and ensure that Europe remains coupled with China. Europe cannot decouple from China because the cost advantage of manufacturing in China and selling in Europe and making big profits, 200, 300% margins, will not be possible if these goods were manufactured anywhere else in the world. And that decoupling, that inability to decouple is what is driving the Europeans also reluctantly to accept the necessity of regime change, to topple the government of Xi Jinping and replace it with a more restrained and more, less of an avaricious government than that exists today in China, and less of a more expansionist government that exists in China today.
All right. I have an interesting question. It's uh, it's it's something that we haven't spoken about, the Chinese-African relationships, and where is that headed? And were the Chinese behind Robert Mugabe stepping down in Zimbabwe? It's an interesting question, and maybe you all can expand on it. Iqbal, if you want to take that.
I was in Kenya on safari 2 years ago. And when I went to Kenya, I was told that he pointed out that there's this particular road built by the Chinese and this railway line that's been laid by the Chinese. So I said, hey, when the Indians went to Kenya at the turn of the 20th century, all the roads were already built by us then and the railroad lines had been laid, but the Chinese are improving upon them. But the Chinese have used Africa as a colonial outpost to suck Africa out of all of its resources. And in Kenya, there's a lot of resentment against the Chinese because they're exceedingly racist and they treat the Africans with contempt. And the popular movement in Africa doesn't view the Chinese as someone beneficial or someone with a benign influence. And I think that, we have lost that opportunity of actually engaging with Africa. And as Maroof said, that we spent 2 billion in Afghanistan. We've tried to spend money in Africa, but the point is this, that we've not been able to engage with the Africans in a way as to bring them within an ambit of, nations or democracies that can resist the whole Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative is not a trade initiative. It is using trade to impose Chinese hegemony and prepare the way to roll out 5G networks and to sell 5G handsets and to sell 5G apps and enslave the whole world to Chinese domination. I mean, I may sound like some kind of futuristic, crazy wacko, but
Yeah.
this is what is actually happening. If you look at it, this is what is actually happening. That is why this trade ban on those friggin' 7 nanometer, 6 nanometer microchips.
Sure.
And that is why that the threat that the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company is facing from the Chinese, and the reason why those 3 carrier battle groups, even though now the Nimitz has moved into the Persian Gulf, you still got the Ronald Reagan and the Franklin Roosevelt 2 carrier battle groups in the South China Sea.
Yeah, that's how we started the conversation, and that's amazing how we circled back to that original question. I have this next question from a colleague of mine, Anubhav Awasthi, and this is Maroof, is for you. His question is, what do you think of the government's efforts to strengthen defense manufacturing equipment? And he has a specific question around the 6716 for the Northern Command, the 72,000 assault rifles. I think the broad question Anubhav is asking is the government's efforts to strengthen defense manufacturing. Are you seeing signs of that? Are there steps being taken?
See, I'm on record to say at a lecture which is organized by the BJP Walas in Belgaum, and when kind of they put the link out and circulated it widely. I said the one area where Mr. Modi's Make in India initiative has not picked up is in defense manufacturing. And the reasons are many. The one is that the armed forces, they don't have a consistent approach to defense acquisition. And that really because you buy what you can based on the threat that exists, and it's a critical purchase to critical purchase. Now there's a lot of paperwork that exists in the armed forces called long-term integrated perspective plan, LTIPP. But those are meant to give out plans over 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. But the problem is that the only route you were asked to take was to go to the defense public sector undertakings, which means they will be making stuff which it takes time, because to even develop a state-of-the-art tank, you would need 15 to 20 years timelines between agreeing on general staff quantitative requirements to and qualitative requirements to designs going back and forth. I mean, the LCA is a case in point. It's not just that our scientists are bad. They can put people on the moon and Mars given the opportunity, but you are not giving them the funding that they need to scale up. Look at Israel. It became an independent country just in 48, the year after we became independent. It's one of the world's leading suppliers of certain top-end defense platforms, from the Arrow missile system, which is the one that guards your skies against missile attacks like the Patriot was meant to do in the Gulf War. Israel makes a lot of close quarter weapon systems, from submachine guns to radar technologies. Even there was talk about putting some Israeli technology in the French Rafales, which are coming in. But the Babu scientist nexus has also made our DPSUs not the most pleasant place to go to do business in, because they'll arrive late for work. They're never driven by targets. They keep getting money from the Ministry of Defense, which keeps going into a kind of recurring account where the money piles up and gives them enough interest to keep their salaries, etc. going. They don't really bother to sell equipment. There's no private sector. I'll give you an example. Baba Kalyani has made the Bharat Forge 105mm artillery gun. First class stuff. Army is on it, but the DPSUs and the MOD bureaucracy is not letting it come in the scale that we could actually have in our Indian Army's artillery inventory. But you'll then go and buy stuff that is available in the world. And most countries create a national security strategy, which is divided into inter-arm strategy, within which you define which arm or service will need, and you buy it keeping into the big umbrella of a national security strategy. Here's the other way around. You buy whatever equipment comes your way, or the leadership tells you to buy it because we need to build up good relations with France or whatever. I'm not dismissing the Rafale, but I'm saying today it's France, tomorrow it could be US, day after it could be back to Russia again. But you have to buy it because these are the countries that make sure that the Kashmir issue is not debated at the UN. To hell with it, damn it. Let Kashmir be debated into UN. It doesn't mean they're going to walk in and put another flag out there. Jab tak Bharat Sena hai, how can somebody think of bloody well walking into Indian territory? And you don't have to buy weapons from them so that they support you at some global forum. You just stand alone. And if the UN doesn't deliver the goods, you walk out of the UN. Only a few diplomats will lose dollar-paying salaries. The rest of us, with or without UN, are doing pretty well. Now go back to defense manufacturing. The government has now initiated the new FDI norms. For all these years, can you believe it? That the FDI norm said that up to 49% somebody can put into your defense industry. That means the HAL or the Bharat Electronics or whatever, their bureaucracy will still control the vote in the board meetings. Now you've said 74 to 100%. Somebody's going to put his money in. but somebody also must put his money in, justifying to his own people that their jobs are shifting to the Indian market. So our industrialists have to be brought in here. Whoever they bring with them, openly or quietly, whether it's the Reliance bringing, the French industries, or it's the Tatas who are bringing some other partnership, let them come in and let them start producing things in an accountable manner. And that has never been the tradition here. एक बार नेहरू ने बोल दिया कि we'll be self-sufficient, तो वो लोगों के लिए एक पेग हो गया उस पे सारी स्टोरीज हैंग करने की. अब बोला है मेक इन इंडिया. Those three words were uttered once on the Red Fort. How much more has been implemented by the successive governments to make things in India? It is not happening because the armed forces are pushed to a corner. Iqbal rightly brought out. I mean, you have a defense budget which is about 1.58% of GDP. I mean, when the parliamentary committee had said that you need to spend for 10 years 3% of GDP to be able to have your defense establishment in the state that you can feel secure. So, and when the crisis hits the fan, then you go running here, there, and everywhere to buy weapon systems. Now, the good thing is that all deals we are doing have a transfer of technology element built into it. But let me tell you that the offset requirement which the government gives to a foreign buyer or a foreign provider of equipment, I'll buy stuff worth $10 billion from you, what will you put back? So he has to commit, or they have to commit to put $3 billion worth back in the Indian market, which is offset. Now, it's not that you buy aircrafts worth 10 billion, so you'll get them to give you 3 billion as a gift. They will create industries here, and it is not just you buy aircrafts, but from that money, they could even create a coastal backup system, or they can provide telecommunications. There are a whole list of items in the offset rules. So again, the defense industry is not benefiting. So, and leading people like Steve Cohen to write the book, India's Ad Hoc Arsenal, because we buy in a crisis from one thing to another. And therefore, I still don't see it happening unless the government does three things. One, it says you've got a 5-year window to buy what you want. After that, after 10 years, that is 5 years plus another 5 years, no foreign goods will be bought. You'll have to make do with what it is. So you follow the Navy's example, which is the only of the three services that has a dedicated engineering element which helps design and produce ships. So the Navy has actually done very well from building ships to submarines. But the other services, they just wait for 36 Rafale to come in before they can take a deep breath and then decide what more. And the army is the same story. So, and officers, by the time they get the hang of the procurement system and the hang of the design system, as per the rules of the game, have had a 3-year cushy posting in Delhi or Bangalore, put the bugger back on the hilltop. So he goes back to the mountain to command a unit, because he says, if you don't command active formation, you will remain a Major Saab. You will not become a General Saab, because you have to go through that thing in your career. Navy has none of that nonsense. So you have to internally restructure yourself, and finally get the private sector in, get Mahindras in, get Tatas in, get Reliance and whoever else. I mean, okay. And if they're making something, God damn it, buy it. Why are you, if you don't want to buy it, allow them to sell it to your neighboring countries who have lesser budgets. That also you will not allow them to sell it. He says we can buy it, but we can't share technology because national security. National security is a bloody cover for all sorts of activities, whether in India or Pakistan.
So I'm going to end this with one last question. I know we've really kind of taken a lot of time today, but in fact, like I said, it's just been so insightful. I couldn't stop myself. So one last question, and Iqbal, that's for you. And it's a political question. It's come from Anshul, and his question is, if it was not the Modi dispensation in government now, do you think the Chinese reaction would have been any different? So his question is, would it have been any different had it been any other government in power? And that's the last question, after which we'll wrap it up.
I don't think so. I think that there has been a uniformity in response right from Mr. Nehru to Mr. Modi. And the only person, I think, where the only government where things were different was when Mrs. Indira Gandhi was in power, because the incidents at Nathula that Maroof had referred to, when General Sagat Singh created a new template for the army to retaliate against the Chinese, happened at that time, and the Bangladesh war happened at that time, where there was a decisive leadership that decided to take on the Chinese. Now, I expected that Mr. Modi would be very decisive in deciding to take on the Chinese, but I think maybe he feels, or he felt that we had trade relationships, greater trade relationships with the Chinese, and the Chinese would not upset the apple cart. But I feel that we have yet to see a government in this country in the last 70 years that has a clear vision and says, yes, we want to see India over here at this point of time over the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. And there has to be a bipartisan consensus in India, political consensus that, look, we politically agree. Now, Mr. Narasimha Rao passed this resolution unanimously in the Indian Parliament in 1993 that Kashmir, every part of Kashmir is sovereign, and we cannot compromise, and nothing, we cannot let anything go away. And when we talk of Kashmir, we only think of the valley. We don't think of Ladakh. Ladakh was an integral part of Kashmir and of the erstwhile state of Maharaja Hari Singh of Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir, and it's an integral part of India. And the Chinese are sitting there. So we go and sign this deal, which brings into existence the LAC. Now, how can you have a parliament that passes a resolution that the entire state is inalienable from India, and then 6 months to 1 year later, you go and sign a deal saying that this is the LAC and this is the ground position, and those maps are not even demarcated. So, I mean, this is a kind of a contradictory approach where one part is saying something when it's emotionally charged, and the other part is doing something else because somebody proposes this from a practical point of view. And so it's this hodgepodge. So let's get our act together. Let's plan and say that, look, China is an adversary. It has been an adversary. We have tried every dance from Kathakali to Kathak in front of the Chinese for the last 70 years, and it hasn't cut any ice. They don't appreciate us. They don't appreciate our culture, and they regard us as an enemy and a potential rival to their seat as the most powerful nation in the world. And we need to be able to realize that, look, let's call a spade and face up to that fact, plan for the future, have a coherent policy, and then move ahead.
Got it. I've loved every moment of it. We started off with the existential crisis that the Chinese faced because of the ban on Huawei. We spoke about the Quad, we spoke about the US and the Chinese, we spoke about Ladakh, we spoke about the Valley. And Maroof, you've given such deep insight into the era of defense and manufacturing, etc. I think between the two gentlemen, I've picked up a lot today, and I've really, really enjoyed. There's so many tons of questions still coming in.
Karan, there's one very interesting question which says that there's so much of Chinese mobileware and security wear in India, and does that pose a problem to India or not? Maroof sir, that question is for you. That there's so much of Chinese hardware, be in terms of security cameras, mobile phones, laptops. So can the PLA use this for spying on Indians? Is that a threat that we should be worried about?
Yes, they are already using it. I've just done my weekly TV show Latitude, which came this morning at 8:30. It'll again come on Times Now tomorrow at 9:30. And it is precisely about how the Americans, the National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, has gone on record to say that America needs to follow India's example of blocking apps like TikTok and others, because the Chinese are listening into everything. They've got massive supercomputers that are picking up what they want. Mr. Jaidev Ranade, who is an earlier CAPSEC is a euphemism for RAW, by the way. He's an earlier CAPSEC gentleman, but now heading an Institute of Chinese Strategy and Analysis. And he says very clearly that China has 50,000 people dedicated to hacking into information related with the Tibetans and certainly the government of India's establishment. So quite clearly, the Americans now are not going to take the route of putting every other Chinese informer into arrest, like they've done with this guy whose name was Dickinson Yo. He was caught engaging with American scientists who make F-35 aircrafts, and Chinese are great ones at stealing stealth technology and reverse engineering them and coming up with a body which looks similar, but the capacity of the technology is not that great. Just like they're claiming that their J-20 fighters are 5th generation, but at the same time, they're trying to buy a 5th generation fighter from the Russians. So yes, the Chinese are now, and you know, by the way, Abhenav, you'd be quite amused to know that my research has shown that we in India are amongst the highest in terms of percentile of people, as a people, who are only too happy to give the name of even our dog onto a website that asks questions. So all that data is allowing them to pick up personalized profiles on you. It is not for nothing that 500 million names and their details and travel patterns and stay patterns were stolen by the Chinese, apparently from the Marriott Hotel Group, right? Why? Because they are just picking up the data to even plot how VIPs travel, how they use certain health systems where they can compromise you by either giving you information that will make you so nervous that you can't take a strategic decision after that, or at least tell you that maybe there can be a friend who can cure you at half the cost. So all this information is being gathered. We have now entered an era where, you know, Chinese importance in various technologies that has become, particularly in the aftermath of COVID, indispensable. You know, for example, we have more than 90% of our cell phones come from China. So if you don't have cheap cell phones, you can't call your driver while you stand in the heat and wait for your car to come up from a car park. I mean, he gets a cheap Chinese cell phone. They have more than 87% technology in television screens. They have 92% technology that's there in a whole lot of things, from air conditioners to pharmaceutical products. So you cannot get a lot of your top end medical treatment or medical support systems that you need for whatever health reasons. So it's not going to be easy to get them out, but it is much easier to understand how not to let them take away their information. Iqbal called me yesterday and he said, Maroof, this is just to tell you that my websites and my email IDs are being hacked all the time. Obviously, because they now know they have somebody who's going to give them a tougher time than the government of India with the information that he's filling out, including, I'd leave that to you and to the audience as a selling point for his book about Mao's sex life. But that you can find out when you read his book. But he has done a lot of research on the Chinese mind. And therefore, if you understand the Chinese mind, you can at least put together a counter to that. If you don't, then you are just, as Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, said, you're just slithering into a situation that you're not going to be able to climb out of. And we are actually almost hovering above the pool of dirt. That is China.
Couldn't have summed it up better. And Abhenav, I'm looking forward to another round in the Thinkers of India, Defenders of India, and I'm sure Maroof and Iqbal would do us the honor.
I think this is an unfolding story, and we are going to be in for quite a few surprises, and it's not going to end so fast.
And
Thank you.
Us ready for next sets. Abhenav, all back to you.
Yeah. No, I want to just share with our viewers about the book, The Red Fear, which is getting launched around the 18th of September. Do look out for this book, and we'll share the link with you very soon once this book is available. I think a lot of interesting things will come out in this. And thank you so much to our panelists for taking out the time and kind of sharing such detailed insights with us. There are a lot of questions from other panelists also who had asked, but unfortunately we just run out of time. If you could just message me those questions, and I will ask the panelists and I will reply to you individually. I'll do that for you. My email is also there in the details of this talk. And thank you all so much. Thank you, Karan, for asking very, very interesting questions. Thank you, Mr. Malhotra. Thank you, Mr. Raza. Thank you so much. And I hope to have you all on this panel very soon again.
It's our pleasure. Thank you very much for
Thank you,
having
sir.
us there.
Bye, guys. See you.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you so
you.
much.